Hello there, and welcome to Depths of Unknown. As you relax, let's slowly drift into the ocean's deepest, unexplained mysteries. There is a question that haunts every ocean disappearance, and it is not the question you think. It is not what happened. In most cases, what happened is not difficult to reconstruct. The physics of a small boat in large seas, the mathematics of hypothermia in water below 15 degrees Celsius, the arithmetic of how long a person can remain afloat without a life jacket in the open ocean. What happened is rarely the mystery. The mystery, the one that makes these cases impossible to close, impossible to forget, and in some ways impossible to grieve, is this: where are they? The ocean does not always return what it takes. It takes people, and it takes them completely, leaving behind only the silence of water and the unsatisfying arithmetic of a search area, too large to be comprehensively surveyed by the resources of any government or navy that has ever attempted it. There is a family somewhere right now, not a metaphorical family, an actual family of real people, who is living with the specific, particular cruelty of not knowing what happened in the final minutes, not knowing if the person they loved suffered, not knowing if they are, in some incomprehensible way, still alive. The ocean's capacity to make people vanish completely, not die, not sink, but vanish, leaving no body, no wreckage, no final message, is one of the most psychologically devastating phenomena in the entire catalogue of human loss. This documentary is about the people the ocean kept, the ones it took and did not return. And by the end of it, you will understand not just who these people were and what the evidence suggests happened to them, but why the ocean's silence is so absolute, why the searches fail, and why the families of the disappeared are left with something that psychology has a name for, but that language struggles to contain. That name is ambiguous loss, and the ocean is its most merciless practitioner. Every disappearance in this documentary has a family behind it. Every set of coordinates where a person was last heard from has a kitchen table somewhere at which someone stopped being able to eat a full meal. Every unanswered search is a legal proceeding that never produces a death certificate, an estate that cannot be settled, a spouse who cannot technically remarry because the person they are married to has not been confirmed dead. The ocean's disappearances are not just tragedies of the people who entered the water, they are ongoing, persistent, decades-long tragedies of the people who remained on the shore. This is what makes them different from every other category of human loss, and this is what makes them worth understanding in full. Not just what happened, not just who these people were, but what the ocean's silence costs the living who are left behind to interpret it. Amelia Earhart disappeared on July 2nd, 1937, somewhere over the central Pacific Ocean during her attempt to circumnavigate the Earth along an equatorial route. She was 40 years old. She was the most famous female aviator in the world, a figure whose public significance extended well beyond aviation into the broader culture of the 1930s as a symbol of what women could accomplish in a world that systematically restricted their ambitions. Her navigator was Fred Noonan, a skilled and experienced maritime pilot who had previously mapped the Pan American Airways routes across the Pacific. Their aircraft was a Lockheed Electra 10E, modified for long-range flight with extra fuel tanks and specialized navigation equipment. The leg that ended their journey was the longest and most challenging of the entire circumnavigation. The 2,556-mile overwater flight from Lae, New Guinea to Howland Island, a tiny 2-mile-long coral island in the middle of the Pacific that had no natural landmarks and required precise navigation to locate. Radio contact between Earhart and the United States Coast Guard cutter Itasca, stationed at Howland Island to assist with navigation, became increasingly desperate in the final hours of the flight. Earhart's transmissions indicated that she could not locate the island and that her fuel was running low, but the Itasca could not establish two-way communication. Earhart was transmitting on a frequency she could send on, but apparently not receive on, meaning she could not hear the Itasca's responses. Earhart's final radio communications reveal a progressive unraveling of navigational certainty. At 7:42 a.m., she transmitted that she was running north and south, but had not sighted the island. At 8:40 a.m., her last confirmed transmission, she reported a specific line of position based on the rising sun, the last navigational fix that could be used to estimate her position. But she had still not located the island. After that, silence. The Itasca heard nothing more. The ship continued to transmit for hours on the frequency Earhart had been using, hoping for any response. None came. The search that followed was the largest in United States naval history to that point, covering approximately 250,000 square miles of ocean with 17 ships and 66 aircraft. Nothing was found. Earhart and Noonan have been the subject of more sustained investigation than almost any other disappearance in aviation history. Hypotheses ranging from crash and sink in the waters near Howland Island to forced landing and survival on Gardner Island, now Nikomororo, to capture by the Japanese Navy have all been seriously argued, evidentially supported to varying degrees, and none definitively established. The ocean that received the Lockheed Electra has never confirmed what it took. Harold Holt was the Prime Minister of Australia. On December 17, 1967, he walked into the surf at Cheviot Beach in Victoria, in seas that witnesses described as rough and dangerous, and swam out. He was never seen again. No body was ever recovered. The immediate and extensive search of the beach and surrounding waters found nothing. The Australian Prime Minister vanished in front of multiple witnesses in broad daylight in shallow coastal water, and the ocean returned no evidence of what happened to him. Holt was known as a strong swimmer and an enthusiastic ocean swimmer who regularly swam in conditions that others found challenging. The waters at Cheviot Beach on December 17 were not, by the accounts of witnesses, conditions in which Holt should have entered the water. The surf was large and irregular, the rips were active, and the beach had no lifeguards. The explanation that has been most consistently accepted by Australian authorities is drowning, that Holt was caught by the surf, exhausted and drowned, and that his body was carried out to sea by currents that prevented its recovery. The absence of the body in Australian coastal waters, where drowning victims are frequently recovered within days, is the aspect of the case that has resisted comfortable closure. A Prime Minister's body is not typically lost to the sea without recovery. The ocean's failure to return Harold Holt has sustained decades of conspiracy theories. He defected to China via submarine. He was extracted by CIA operatives. He faked his death. None of which are supported by credible evidence, but all of which persists because the alternative explanation, that an Australian Prime Minister simply drowned and was carried away by a rip current and was never found, is psychologically unsatisfying in a way that the ocean's absolute silence tends to make all its disappearances. A royal commission conducted in 2005, 38 years after Holt's disappearance, formally found that Holt had drowned. The commission's conclusion was reasonable given the available evidence. Holt entered rough water, was not seen to surface, and no alternative explanation is supported by evidence. But the finding brought no body, no definitive location, no gravestone, and therefore no complete closure to the family or to the Australian public. The formal legal declaration that Harold Holt drowned did not change the ocean's silence about where his body had gone. An official verdict of death cannot compel the ocean to return what it took, and the ocean had kept Holt as completely as if he had never entered it at all. Donald Crowhurst entered the 1968 Golden Globe race, the first single-handed, non-stop, around-the-world sailing race, with a boat that was not ready, a financial situation that was desperate, and a psychological profile that the pressures of the race would expose and ultimately destroy. The Golden Globe race required competitors to sail around the world alone, without stopping and without assistance, in any direction and in any vessel of their choosing. Crowhurst, a British electronics businessman from Bridgewater, Somerset, entered the race partly for the prize money and partly under financial pressure from sponsors whose investment in his participation was contingent on his completion of it. His vessel, the Teignmouth Electron, was a trimaran design that Crowhurst himself believed was potentially unseaworthy for Southern Ocean conditions, but the combination of financial pressure, public commitment, and the collapse of alternatives led him to depart on the last possible day, October 31st, 1968, in a boat that was not adequately prepared. What followed is one of the most psychologically complex stories in the history of ocean sailing, documented in astonishing detail because Crowhurst kept an extraordinarily thorough record in his logbooks. He sailed south from England, realized almost immediately that his boat could not safely complete the Southern Ocean passage, and made a decision that he documented, but that it took years after his death to fully understand. He would loiter in the South Atlantic, fabricating false position reports that showed him sailing around the world at extraordinary speed, and then rejoin the race near the end and claim a respectable but not suspicious finish. The fabrication worked for a while, but as the months of solitude accumulated, as the psychological isolation of months alone at sea without human contact, without honest communication, and with the full weight of his deception became unsustainable, Crowhurst's logbooks, discovered when the Teignmouth Electron was found drifting and empty in the Atlantic in July 1969, reveal a mind in progressive dissolution. His final log entries from late June 1969 are extraordinary documents of psychological dissolution. They are philosophically elaborate, internally consistent in a way that makes them more disturbing rather than less, and written in the hand of a person who has constructed a complete private cosmology in which the act of leaving the boat is not suicide, but a form of cosmic reintegration. He wrote about time, about mathematics, about the nature of consciousness, about the relationship between individual identity and universal process. He wrote as though he had solved something. The entries do not read like farewell notes. They read like the culmination of a sustained intellectual project whose conclusions happen to include the necessity of the writer's departure. His final entries are not the writings of a person who has decided to die, but of a person who has lost the ability to maintain the cognitive coherence that living requires in the conventional sense. A person for whom the boundary between the philosophical and the literal had dissolved completely during months of isolation, deception, and the mounting impossibility of return. His body was never found. The trimaran was found drifting with no one aboard and the logbooks open. Crowhurst had gone over the side at some point in the previous days, and the ocean took him and kept him. The ocean's capacity to retain the people it takes is not a mystery but a physics problem, and understanding the physics is essential to understanding why the searches fail and why the families are left without closure. A body that enters the ocean does not simply sink, it floats initially. Human beings are approximately the same density as seawater, slightly buoyant if they have air in their lungs, and the early stages of a disappearance involve a body or a person at or near the surface, potentially visible to searchers if the search is initiated quickly enough and directed accurately enough. But the ocean is not a static medium. The currents that move water around the ocean basins move anything that floats with them, and the trajectory of a floating object in open ocean is determined by the interaction of surface currents, wind-driven drift, and wave action in ways that are difficult to predict precisely even with modern oceanographic modeling. In the time between a person entering the water and a search being initiated, which in ocean disappearances is typically hours at minimum and often days, the distance between the entry point and the location of a floating person or body can be tens to hundreds of kilometers. Searches that are conducted at the entry point, rather than at the projected drift endpoint, will not find what they are looking for. The second physical process that removes bodies from the ocean's recoverable inventory is decomposition combined with animal scavenging. In open ocean, a body that is not recovered within the first few days is subjected to the combined action of marine organisms, first fish, then crustaceans, then the microorganisms of decomposition, whose combined action over weeks to months can reduce a body to scattered skeletal remains distributed over an area too large to systematically survey. The ocean's biological community is extraordinarily efficient at processing organic matter. The process begins within hours of death, first with small fish and opportunistic feeders, then with crustaceans, then with the succession of specialist scavengers that process the reduced remains, and finally with the bacterial decomposition that completes what the animals began. In warm tropical water, this process is faster than in cold polar water. But in no oceanic environment does a body persist indefinitely in recoverable form. The bones that remain after soft tissue decomposition are subject to dispersal by current and scavenging, and the silicate-rich chemistry of the deep ocean tends to dissolve bone over timescales of years to decades. The mathematical consequence of these biological processes is that a person who enters the ocean and is not recovered within the first week to 10 days has an exponentially decreasing probability of being found in any recognizable form, and a person not recovered within the first months has essentially no probability of being found at all, regardless of how intensive the subsequent search becomes. What it does not consume, the currents carry to places that searchers have never reached. The physical consequence of these combined processes is that the window during which a person lost at sea is recoverable is narrow, is heavily dependent on the accuracy of the initial search direction, and closes permanently over a time scale of days to weeks. After that window closes, the ocean has kept what it took. The 2014 disappearance of Malaysia Airlines flight MH370, with 239 people aboard, is the most extensively searched ocean disappearance in history, and the one whose failure of resolution has most profoundly confronted the public with the ocean's capacity to retain what it takes. The aircraft departed Kuala Lumpur on March 8, 2014, bound for Beijing, and at approximately 1019 a.m., after the co-pilot's last verbal communication with air traffic control, the transponder was switched off and the aircraft disappeared from civilian radar. What followed was an international investigation and search effort of unprecedented scale. Satellite data eventually indicated that the aircraft had flown south into the Indian Ocean on autopilot for approximately 7 hours after its last radar contact, exhausted its fuel, and descended into the water somewhere in a search zone in the southern Indian Ocean. The search of that zone, more than 120,000 square kilometers of ocean in one of the most remote, deep, and weather-affected parts of the planet, was the largest underwater search ever conducted, involving multiple nations, multiple search vessels, autonomous underwater vehicles capable of surveying the seafloor at depths of several kilometers, and towed sonar arrays searching millions of square meters of ocean floor. After years of searching, covering the primary search zone and expanding into secondary zones based on revised drift analysis, the wreckage of MH370 has not been found. A relatively small number of debris pieces, consistent with MH370, have washed ashore on Indian Ocean coastlines over the years following the disappearance, confirming the general region of the crash and the ocean's conservative verdict. It kept almost everything, returning only fragments, and even those fragments took months and years to arrive at distant shores, carried by the same currents that remove floating objects from the reach of the initial search. The 239 people aboard MH370 are in the Indian Ocean. The ocean has not said where. The families of the passengers, families in Malaysia, China, Australia, France, and a dozen other countries, have lived for years in the specific liminal state of ocean loss, knowing that their family member is dead with a certainty that approaches mathematical certainty, but unable to perform the rituals of grieving that require a body, a grave, a confirmed time and place of death. Some families have pursued independent legal proceedings, demanding accountability from the airline, the government, and the aviation regulators whose systems failed to prevent the disappearance. Some have hired independent investigators to review the satellite data and propose alternative search zones. Some have simply waited, in the way that families of the oceans disappeared have always waited, for the ocean to return something, anything that would convert the abstract knowledge of death into the concrete fact of it. The debris that has arrived, flaperon sections, interior panels, window frames, has confirmed the crash, but not located it. Each piece confirms that MH370 is in the Indian Ocean. None of them says exactly where. The ocean's disclosure, in the case of MH370, has been as minimal as it has been in every other disappearance in this documentary. Enough to confirm, not enough to resolve. The cases of Earhart, Holt, and Crowhurst are among the most documented ocean disappearances in history, but they represent a tiny fraction of the people the ocean has taken and kept. Joshua Slocum, the first person to sail single-handedly around the world, departed on a voyage from Martha's Vineyard in November 1909 and was never seen again. Slocum was 65 years old, an extraordinarily experienced sailor who had spent more of his adult life at sea than on land, and whose 1900 memoir, Sailing Alone Around the World, remains one of the classics of maritime literature. His vessel, the Spray, was found drifting near the Bahamas, empty, sometime in the winter of 1909. Slocum's disappearance, a man who had sailed around the world alone and survived conditions that would have defeated most sailors, is a reminder that the ocean does not make exceptions for experience. Glenn Miller, the big band musician whose orchestra defined the sound of the late 1930s and early 1940s, disappeared over the English Channel on December 15, 1944. On a flight from England to Paris to arrange concerts for American troops who had recently liberated the French capital, the aircraft, a single-engine Norseman, was never found. Miller was 40 years old. No wreckage was recovered, no body was ever identified, and the English Channel, a heavily trafficked body of water with a long history of maritime traffic, kept what it took with the same absolute completeness as the open Pacific. Sir John Franklin led an expedition of 2 ships and 134 men into the Arctic in 1845, seeking the Northwest Passage. All 134 men died, some from disease, some from starvation, some from lead poisoning from improperly sealed food tins, and the majority of their remains have never been found, although the ships themselves were located by underwater survey in 2014 and 2016. The Arctic Ocean's capacity to preserve what it keeps, in ice, in cold water, in the permafrost of the surrounding landscape, means that some of Franklin's men may be remarkably intact in locations that no search has yet reached. The stories of the disappeared are not simply stories of death at sea. They are stories of incompleteness, of lives that ended without the narrative closure that a body, a gravestone, a definite time and place of death provides. They are stories about what happens to grief when it cannot be completed because the fact of death cannot be confirmed. What the ocean's capacity to disappear people ultimately reveals is not a supernatural quality, but a measurable one. A quality that emerges from the specific combination of the ocean's size, its depth, its current systems, its biological activity, and the inherent limitations of human search technology and human search resources applied to an environment that is hostile to search in ways that no other environment on Earth is. The ocean is approximately 361 million square kilometers in area, with an average depth of approximately 3,700 meters, and the technology capable of visually surveying the seafloor at that depth must do so from a very short range, a few tens of meters, meaning that surveying the entire ocean floor would require a search effort so vast that it has no realistic connection to any actual or proposed search program. The MH370 search covered 120,000 square kilometers of seafloor at enormous cost over multiple years and did not find the aircraft. The entire ocean floor is 3,000 times larger than the area searched for MH370. Every person the ocean has taken, Earhart, Holt, Crowhurst, the passengers of MH370, Slocum, Glenn Miller, and the hundreds of thousands of others who have entered the ocean and not returned in all of recorded history, is somewhere within those 361 million square kilometers. They are not nowhere. They are somewhere very specific at a depth and a location that could in principle be specified with coordinates if the coordinates were known. The ocean has not destroyed them in the sense of eliminating their physical existence from the universe. It has simply placed them in a location whose address it has not disclosed. This is not a small distinction. The families of those who die on land, in accidents, in hospitals, in wars where the body is recovered, receive the confirmation of physical remains. The grieving process that psychology describes, the staged, non-linear, eventually resolving process by which human beings accommodate the death of someone they loved, depends at its most fundamental level on the fact of the death being confirmed and the remains being located. Without that confirmation, the grieving process cannot fully engage its normal mechanisms, because the central fact around which those mechanisms organize, the confirmed death of a specific person at a specific time in a specific place, does not exist. Psychologists call this ambiguous loss. The theorist Pauline Boss, who first described and named the concept, identified ocean loss as one of the clearest examples of ambiguous loss in the literature. A person is physically absent but psychologically present. Their status is unresolved, and the normal mourning processes that would allow their family to reorganize their lives around the fact of the death cannot fully proceed because the fact is not formally established. Some families of oceans disappeared have described the experience as grieving while being told not to grieve, as living in a permanent present tense with a person who is neither here nor gone, whose presence in memory cannot be converted into presence in mourning because the ocean that kept them has not confirmed that keeping. The ocean does not destroy them, it keeps them, and the keeping is what costs the families everything that remains. The ocean does not destroy them, it simply places them beyond the reach of the instruments and the vessels and the search grids that human civilization can bring to bear. It keeps them in its own way, in a dark it does not share, at depths where the search never reaches, carried by currents whose full trajectories have never been traced, in a silence so absolute that it has a psychological name, and in a darkness so complete that it is, for the families who wait, indistinguishable from forever. The ocean keeps what it takes, and what it has taken across all of recorded human history, across every latitude and every depth, is more than the people whose names appear in this documentary. It is also the certainty that those people's families needed to grieve and were never given.